and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Tonight's program originates in our Time for Talk studios in the Slicer Street Church. And now, it's time for talk.
We're going to dip back in history tonight. You always seem to enjoy this, at least from the reports I get from you. We're going to look back at a history of southeast Missouri by Douglas and dip back also into the history of Dunklin County, Missouri, 1845-1895 by Davis. Both of these books contain some interesting things, and we have chosen tonight to talk to you about the courthouse. Now, courthouses have come and courthouses have gone, and really we picked up a little paper that's at the courthouse. If you'd like some further things that without too much reading, you can pick up one of these, I'm sure, at the courthouse still. My copy has gotten sort of crumpled up, but it was most interesting. Let me tell you what I know. I may tell you more than I know. There have been 4 courthouses, to my knowledge, from what I read, in Dunklin County. The first courthouse, of course, Dunklin County was laid out as a county in 1846, and the first courthouse met under a large oak tree in the vicinity of the square where it is now. And the room was 10 by 12, and it said the wind whistled through the logs so much that they lined it with cotton. The men who were going to work in there, the judges, the lawyers, lined it with cotton so the wind that came through wouldn't blow the papers off their desks. There were hewn log seats with wooden peg legs. And the men who had to spend a lot of time there, for instance, if they were going to be there all day, brought their own chairs because of the uncomfortable benches there. That gave way to the first courthouse in 1847. And that first courthouse was a magnificent structure, somebody says, and according to this little paper, it was a 40-foot square, 1.5-story building. Had 2 big windows with 8 by 10 panes of glass in them and 12 panes to a window, and they said that made it a most imposing structure. When you looked at it from a distance, it was 1.5 stories high. There was an outside stairs to the public official's office and the jurors' rooms, and that was the talk of the county. It was destroyed by fire in the 1860s, and of course the Yanks blamed the Feds, and the Feds blamed the Confederates, and vice versa, and nobody really knows what happened. In 1870, there was another courthouse built, and it was destroyed in 1872. Courthouses didn't last long in these days for some reason. And this is the fire of 1872 is the one that destroyed all of the records in the county. And that appeal had to go out if you had records to bring them in, and we have to recopy them and redo it. For 20 years, there was no courthouse in the county. I guess if they got one burned down in 2 years, they decided it wasn't really worth the effort. And in this 1845 to 1895 book, there is included in here, of course, the courthouse that was built in Kennett that's a forerunner of the one we know now. We have some pictures we're going to show you about this. But in that intervening time of 20 years, the court was held in a building like this. It was held in a wooden structure on Tatum block, just in one of the store buildings there. That's called Tatum Block, Kennett. That's all I know about this. So for 20 years, they just had a makeshift courtroom, and then in 1891, they approved bonds for this old red courthouse that we're going to show you. And I want you to know that architects applied from all over the country, and they settled on one architect. The style was debated in the Kennett Clipper and in lots of papers here. They settled on one architect, and the price was to be $15,000 for that building, and that was an unheard of sum in those days. Now, there was some interesting controversy that went on about that building. You see, there were no brick buildings in the Kennett area. We were sand, and anybody that knew anything knew that any kind of structure made out of bricks would be too heavy for the sand to hold up, and that your building gradually would just disappear into the earth. And so anybody who assumed that a brick building could be built was just laughed off of the map. The architect said a brick courthouse could be built, and thereby hangs an interesting tale. Mr. Paul Slicer, who was born in 1902 and who heard many of these things, talks about a brickworks that was out at the present site of the Twin Rivers Regional Medical Center. Let's listen to Mr. Slicer.
The brick, and they dug that out, and they'd haul this clay, you know, made out of clay, and they'd haul this clay and make them right there, and then they'd haul the brick to, that's what the first courthouse was made out of.
Somebody mentioned to me that there was great speculation about whether or not a brick building would be too heavy for this sand land to hold, and people were afraid of it for a while. They said, why, you building a brick and it'll just disappear. Well, did you hear any of that?
Yes, ma'am, we heard a lot of that, but they had a way around that. They took 30-foot cypress poles, which were about, I'd say 15 inches around, and they drove them in the ground. And now there's a building in Kennett right now. It's the that sportsman building there. The
Skeeter Kell Sporting Goods?
Skeeter Kell. They drove the poles down all around to that building.
To keep it from disappearing when they made it a brick?
Disappearing, that's right.
Oh, they really
My daddy hauled the poles for that.
All right.
And the running gear of the buildings, you know, they'd go out to the Barney River. Or
Kennett, Missouri, the big freeze in 1902, you have that labeled.
Yeah.
You're standing in front of, are these power lines that are down?
Those are power lines. This was, of course, this is the year I was born, but Nell Sexton had that picture, and she gave it to me. That's a cousin of mine.
All right. Explain where we are now.
We're on the south side of the square. This is the courthouse there in the center, and these are people that's trying to go to work. And of course, over here is those buildings where Roth and all that.
But we're right on the.
We're right on the square, and of course, this is dirt. There wasn't any.
No pavement of any sort.
Pavement.
Just got the dirt streets. Okay.
That's right.
All right. Do you think the winters were colder then than they are now? That's a debatable issue. Now, the courthouse that was built in 1891, that old red courthouse that was torn down in 1937, holds a lot of interesting history to people because a lot of our older citizens identify with that courthouse. For instance, Clara Donaldson remembers as a child, early 1900s we're talking about, as she went to school and the use she made of the old courthouse clock. Do you remember the original courthouse? I have no idea when it was built. The old one on the square?
Oh, sure.
Oh, you do?
Oh, yes. Oh, my, yes.
Well, now, where was that?
Right there where the...
Yeah, okay, right in the center.
Right in the center. And it was a red brick, and it was a very fine building, so we thought. It was, I guess, for that time. And it had a clock on top that struck the hour and the half hour. And it was wonderful for kids. They knew what time it was, any time, you know.
Yeah.
And you could just play along to school, and when you could get almost to the school, about a block from the school, then you could just slow down and just fool around all you wanted to, and when that clock began to strike 8, you had plenty of time to get to school. And I hear that same bell every Sunday morning.
What do you mean you hear that same bell?
So we're on the Baptist church, and they ring.
Is that right?
It rings ding dong now, but on the courthouse it just said dong dong.
Okay, and it's the same bell.
Same bell. Huh?
Is that
I think Albert Ford did that.
Town clock back during the second election of President Wilson, they almost shot the town clock off, and it got where it wouldn't run.
What now? They shot the town clock?
They put quite a few holes in it during the second election of Wilson.
Okay, were they celebrating Wilson being elected?
I can recall, and somebody said, well, you're wrong, you can't recall that. But I do recall they had a big bonfire across on the west side of the courthouse, built a big bonfire, and everybody had their guns in town. And I know that was the celebration.
What were you waiting to do, to hear from the election,
waiting
from the
to hear
radio?
From the election. waiting to hear from the election.
Okay, so it's 1918, and you're waiting to hear, and everybody's at the
bonfire. That came up, and then sitting here reminiscing about the courthouse.
Now wait a minute! Don't leave. They had a bonfire, and everybody brought their guns, and they shot the big old clock.
And well, they wasn't supposed to shoot the town clock, but that's what they, they got wild with them guns, and the town clock ended up the next morning with a few holes in it.
But that wasn't surely why they tore the courthouse down to fix the clock.
Well, it could have been, but just sitting here reminiscing.
As he sat there and reminisced, he did relate a most amusing story about the wide hall that was in the old courthouse. We thought it funny.
The old courthouse before that had quite a wide hallway. In fact, this man named Red Liggett got arrested for driving his car through the hallway of the courthouse. Of course, he had to jump 2 steps to get out and in the courthouse, but he drove right down the hall. It was that wide.
And so he came off the street and up the steps and drove his
drove his car
right
of some kind. I would be afraid to say, no telling,
Okay, now, why did they tear the old courthouse down? We don't have the answer to why they tore the old courthouse down. We do want to back up and show you one picture we got from an 1894 book. Let me orient you. You are looking at the courthouse on the extreme right of the picture. There is a coal yard or a wood yard right in front of you. There may have been what you see just this side of the courthouse. There may have been the privy Paul Price talked about. In the background, framed between the 2 poles, you see what was the old Bank of Kennett, and next to that, J.C. Penney, that is now the Sport Club. Just a shot of the square as you look as it was in 1894. Now, as to the question of why they tore the courthouse down, Paul, of course, didn't know, but I have read that the dome had sunk several inches, that the joists were pulled out of the walls, that the circuit court was in dangerous condition, and the Dunklin Democrat said it was the worst courthouse in the state of Missouri. So they decided something had to be done about it, and we have just a short sequence of some actual WPA work that was going on in 1939. Paul, the courthouse that sits here right now, of course, was built in when? Finished in 1939, something like that?
39, 40, I don't know.
WPA labor brought it in, and people were really glad to get the work. What do you remember about the courthouse before that?
The old courthouse before that had quite a wide hallway. In fact, there's a man named Red Liggett.
We've talked tonight about courthouses. We have shown you what we know about the early ones, and of course everyone recognizes the picture that's still on this brochure of the present-day courthouse. It was completed in February of 1940 and was an imposing structure. It cost $178,000, and that's the one whose halls you walk today. We hope you've enjoyed this backward look into history.
You have been watching Time for Talk.